Richmond, Virginia, December 15th, 1985. The historic downtown district stood quiet under the first winter snow when Jennifer Bennett arrived at her father's clock repair shop that Sunday morning. The Bennett workshop had occupied the same brick building on East Main Street for over a century, its reputation built on 3 generations of masterful horologists. But on this particular December day, something felt profoundly wrong. Jennifer had expected to find Thomas Bennett, her 47-year-old father, preparing for the week ahead as he always did on Sunday mornings. Instead, she discovered the workshop eerily still. Every tool hung in its designated place on the pegboard walls. Dozens of timepieces lined the shelves in perfect order. The workbench displayed the same meticulous organization that had defined Thomas's entire career. Yet the man himself had vanished. "So glad to have you here. Comment your city so I can bring cases from your region and also know where you're watching me from." The detail that stopped Jennifer cold was the grandfather clock near the entrance. Its ornate hands pointed to exactly midnight, frozen at the threshold between Saturday and Sunday. Thomas would never have allowed any timepiece in his workshop to stop. Time, he often said, was the one constant that demanded respect and precision. She immediately contacted the Richmond Police Department. Detective Christopher Williams arrived within the hour, his experienced eyes scanning the scene for irregularities. The front door showed no signs of forced entry. Windows remained locked from inside. The cash register held the expected amount from Saturday's business. Nothing appeared stolen or disturbed. But Christopher noticed something Jennifer had missed in her initial panic. The back door, leading to the alley behind the shop, stood slightly ajar. The detective photographed the scene, noting that the lock mechanism appeared functional and undamaged. Someone had simply walked out and left the door unlocked, an action completely out of character for the meticulous Thomas Bennett. The investigation began immediately. Officers canvassed neighboring businesses and residents. The antique bookstore owner next door, Michael Patterson, reported hearing an unusual sound around midnight. He described it as multiple clocks chiming simultaneously, creating an almost musical cacophony that lasted several minutes before falling silent. Michael found this strange because the workshop typically maintained a carefully staggered chiming schedule to avoid exactly that kind of noise. Sarah Chen, who lived in the apartment above her family's restaurant across the street, provided another curious detail. She had been reading late Saturday night when movement in the workshop caught her attention. Through her window, she observed lights turning on and off in a sequential pattern, almost methodical, as if someone was conducting a systematic search or inspection of the premises. Detective Williams requested Thomas's recent financial records. The bank statements revealed something unexpected. 3 weeks before his disappearance, Thomas had withdrawn $5,000 in cash, an unusually large sum. 2 days before vanishing, he had purchased 2 train tickets to Charleston, South Carolina, scheduled for departure on December 16th. The tickets remained unused. Jennifer began her own examination of her father's personal effects in the small office at the back of the shop. She discovered a leather-bound journal hidden in a locked drawer. The key hung on Thomas's personal key ring, which remained in the workshop. Inside, the journal contained technical drawings of clock mechanisms, but also cryptic notes written in her father's distinctive handwriting. The entries from November painted a picture of growing obsession. Thomas had written repeatedly about family obligations and historical debts. One passage mentioned needing to correct errors that had been allowed to persist for too long. Another entry referenced a Victorian-era pocket watch he had recently accepted for restoration, describing it as more significant than it initially appeared. Detective Williams interviewed regular customers and fellow horologists in the area. Daniel Rodriguez, who operated a competing repair shop, mentioned that Thomas had seemed distracted during their last conversation in early December. Thomas had asked unusual questions about authenticating antique timepieces and determining their true provenance. He seemed particularly interested in identifying pieces that might have questionable ownership histories. The workshop's appointment book revealed that Thomas had been scheduled to return the Harrison family pocket watch on December 14th. Elizabeth Harrison, the elderly matriarch of a prominent Richmond family, confirmed that her family's treasured heirloom had been delivered to Thomas for restoration in October. The watch, a magnificent 18th-century piece with intricate engravings, held tremendous sentimental and monetary value. Thomas had promised the restoration would be complete before Christmas, but the watch was nowhere to be found in the workshop. As the first week of investigation concluded, Detective Williams faced a perplexing situation. No body had been discovered. No evidence of struggle existed. Thomas Bennett had simply ceased to exist at the stroke of midnight, leaving behind a frozen clock and unanswered questions. Jennifer remained convinced her father would never abandon his life's work voluntarily. Thomas had invested everything in the workshop, in preserving the family legacy. Yet someone had carefully locked the front door from inside and walked out the back, taking nothing but themselves and apparently one antique pocket watch. The case took an even stranger turn when postal workers delivered a package addressed to the workshop. Inside, Detective Williams found a collection of vintage watch repair manuals and a handwritten note in Thomas's script. The note simply stated that these materials should be donated to the Horological Society, as he would no longer need them. The package had been mailed on December 14th, the day before Thomas disappeared. It suggested premeditation, careful planning, a man preparing for a deliberate departure rather than a victim of circumstance. But why would a successful craftsman, a devoted father, a pillar of the community, choose to vanish at midnight, stopping every clock in his beloved workshop as he departed? And what secrets did that missing Victorian pocket watch hold that might explain his disappearance? The answers, if they existed, remained locked somewhere in the silent workshop where time itself had stopped. Traces in time. Spring 1986. The investigation into Thomas Bennett's disappearance had stretched through the cold Virginia winter, yielding frustratingly little progress. Detective Christopher Williams maintained his commitment to the case, even as department resources shifted toward more recent crimes. Jennifer Bennett refused to accept her father's absence as permanent, dedicating herself to understanding what had driven him away. The breakthrough came not from official police work, but from Jennifer's persistent examination of her father's business records. She discovered a pattern of unusual transactions dating back 18 months. Thomas had made regular wire transfers to an antiquities dealer named Patrick Morrison in Charleston, South Carolina. The amounts varied, but the frequency suggested an ongoing relationship rather than isolated purchases. Detective Williams contacted Charleston authorities to investigate Morrison's establishment. The antique shop occupied a narrow building in the historic district, specializing in timepieces and mechanical curiosities from the 18th and 19th centuries. Patrick Morrison proved cooperative, though his information raised more questions than answers. Morrison confirmed that Thomas Bennett had been purchasing documentation, not physical objects. Specifically, Thomas sought provenance records, authentication certificates, and historical inventories related to clock and watch collections from prominent Southern families. Morrison described Thomas as obsessed with tracing the legitimate ownership chains of antique timepieces, particularly those manufactured in Europe and imported to America before 1900. The detective obtained copies of all correspondence between Thomas and Morrison. The letters revealed Thomas's growing concern about what he termed historical irregularities in the horological trade. He referenced multiple instances where valuable timepieces had changed hands under suspicious circumstances, often during periods of social upheaval, such as the Civil War or the economic depressions of the late 1800s. Meanwhile, Jennifer continued excavating her father's hidden records. Behind a false panel in his desk, she discovered 3 leather journals dating from different decades. The oldest belonged to her great-grandfather, Samuel Bennett, who had established the workshop in 1887. Samuel's meticulous handwriting documented every repair, every sale, every piece that passed through the shop during its founding years. But interspersed among the professional entries were troubling admissions. Samuel Bennett had participated in what he euphemistically called procurement arrangements. Wealthy clients would commission him to acquire specific antique timepieces, often without asking too many questions about their origin. Samuel rationalized these transactions as business necessities during economically challenging times. The second journal belonged to Jennifer's grandfather, Robert Bennett, who operated the workshop from 1920 through 1965. Robert's entries suggested he had discovered Samuel's questionable dealings only late in his own career. He expressed shame and determination to operate with complete integrity, but never explicitly addressed how to rectify the historical problems his father had created. The third journal was Thomas's own, spanning from 1968 to the week before his disappearance. His entries revealed a man gradually discovering the full extent of his family's complicated legacy. Thomas had begun seriously investigating the workshop's history after a customer made an offhand comment about a clock that supposedly had an interesting past. That investigation led Thomas down a disturbing path. He cross-referenced Samuel Bennett's journals with historical records from the Virginia Historical Society, newspaper archives, and estate sale catalogs. Pattern after pattern emerged showing timepieces that had belonged to financially distressed families mysteriously appearing in Samuel's inventory shortly thereafter, sold to wealthy collectors at substantial profit. Thomas's most recent entries focused specifically on the Harrison pocket watch. His research indicated the watch had originally belonged to the Whitmore family of Charleston, prominent merchants who fell into financial ruin after the Civil War. The timepiece disappeared from inventories in 1886, only to surface in Richmond a year later in Samuel Bennett's possession. He had sold it to the grandfather of Elizabeth Harrison, representing it as an authenticated European import. This discovery had devastated Thomas. According to his journal, the watch wasn't just stolen property. It was a family heirloom that had been essentially looted from people in desperate circumstances. When Elizabeth Harrison brought the same watch to Thomas for restoration, unaware of its true history, he faced an impossible ethical dilemma. Detective Williams interviewed Elizabeth Harrison again, this time with more specific questions. The elderly woman confirmed that her grandfather had purchased the watch from Samuel Bennett in 1887, along with documentation certifying its provenance. She had treasured it for decades as a symbol of her family's history, never knowing it represented someone else's loss. The detective's investigation expanded to include other families whose ancestors had done business with Samuel Bennett. Records suggested dozens of transactions that warranted scrutiny. Each represented a potential case of questionable acquisition, though proving theft after a century posed insurmountable legal challenges. Bank records revealed another crucial detail. Starting in January 1985, Thomas had begun making small anonymous donations to various historical societies and family heritage organizations in Virginia and the Carolinas. The amounts matched his withdrawals from the business account, suggesting he was attempting some form of restitution. The train tickets to Charleston took on new meaning. Detective Williams theorized that Thomas had planned to personally return the Harrison watch to descendants of the Whitmore family, if any could be located. But something had prevented that planned journey. Thomas had disappeared the day before his scheduled departure. A canvass of Charleston revealed no trace of Thomas Bennett. He had made no hotel reservations, rented no vehicles, contacted no local horologists. Whatever plan he had formulated remained unexecuted. In April, Jennifer discovered another hidden compartment in the workshop, this one beneath a loose floorboard in the storage room. Inside lay a collection of documents that made her blood run cold. Receipts, certificates of authenticity, correspondence between Samuel Bennett and various dealers, all suggesting a systematic operation that spanned decades. But most disturbing was a map, carefully drawn in Thomas's hand, showing locations throughout Virginia and neighboring states. Each marked location corresponded to a family whose timepieces had passed through the Bennett workshop under circumstances that Thomas's research had deemed questionable. Detective Williams realized they were no longer investigating a simple missing person case. Thomas Bennett had uncovered a historical pattern of acquisition that might qualify as organized theft, perpetrated by his own ancestor. The weight of that discovery, the implications for the family business reputation, and the impossibility of making things right after so many years could have driven Thomas to desperate measures. The question remained whether Thomas had fled from shame, hidden himself while attempting restitution, or encountered someone who wanted the past to stay buried. And somewhere in that tangle of historical crimes and contemporary consequences lay the answer to what happened at midnight in December. The investigation was about to take an even darker turn when someone began sending anonymous letters to the Richmond Police Department, letters that claimed to know exactly where Thomas Bennett had gone and why he could never come back. Hidden compartments. Summer 1986. The anonymous letters arrived weekly throughout May and June, each postmarked from different Virginia cities. Detective Christopher Williams treated each envelope as potential evidence, documenting postmarks, paper types, and handwriting characteristics. The messages contained cryptic references to debts unpaid and truths better left buried, but nothing concrete enough to pursue. Then, in early July, a construction incident changed everything. The building adjacent to the Bennett workshop underwent renovations to convert the upper floors into modern apartments. During demolition work, contractors accidentally breached the shared wall between the two buildings. The damage revealed something unexpected: a hollow space within the Bennett workshop's structure that appeared on no architectural plans. Jennifer Bennett obtained permission to investigate the discovery. Behind layers of brick and plaster, workers uncovered a sealed room approximately 8 feet square. The air that escaped when they first opened it carried the musty scent of decades of isolation. Inside, arranged on wooden shelves built directly into the walls, sat dozens of antique timepieces. Detective Williams documented each item meticulously: pocket watches, mantel clocks, wall-mounted timepieces, even several ornate music boxes with clock mechanisms. Most dated from the mid to late 1800s. Many showed signs of careful preservation, wrapped in cloth or housed in protective cases. None appeared in any of the workshop's official inventory records. Jennifer recognized her great-grandfather Samuel's organizational system in the arrangement. Each piece bore a small tag with cryptic notations, combinations of letters and numbers that meant nothing to modern observers. But when she cross-referenced these codes with Samuel's journals, a disturbing pattern emerged. The hidden collection represented items that Samuel Bennett had never officially acquired and therefore never officially sold. These were pieces that existed in a shadow inventory, obtained through methods he deliberately kept off the books. The implications suggested not just questionable business practices, but systematic deception spanning decades. Among the collection, Jennifer discovered documentation that Samuel had carefully preserved alongside the timepieces themselves. Estate sale notices, newspaper obituaries, even handwritten letters from families in financial distress. Samuel had apparently kept records of exactly where each piece originated, perhaps as insurance, or perhaps burdened by guilt he never publicly acknowledged. One folder contained particularly extensive documentation about the Whitmore family of Charleston. The materials traced the family's decline following the Civil War, their gradual liquidation of assets, and the eventual dispersal of their possessions through various dealers and intermediaries. The Harrison pocket watch that Thomas had been restoring appeared in a detailed inventory list, along with dates and transaction amounts that contradicted the official story of its provenance. But the most significant discovery lay at the back of the hidden room. Behind the shelves, workers found a leather satchel containing recent additions to the collection. These items showed no dust accumulation, no signs of decades of storage. Someone had placed them there within the past year. Inside the satchel, Detective Williams found 5 antique timepieces and a thick file of modern research documents. The research bore Thomas Bennett's signature attention to detail, tracing each item's history from original owners through various transactions to their current, or rather recent, locations. Each file concluded with contact information for families who appeared to be legitimate descendants of the original owners. The detective realized what Thomas had been doing. He had been systematically locating pieces from Samuel's shadow collection and researching their proper ownership. The items in the satchel represented pieces he had successfully tracked and apparently recovered, preparing them for return to rightful heirs or descendants. Jennifer found a handwritten ledger tucked into the satchel. Thomas had documented every piece he identified from the hidden room, creating a master list of what he called historical corrections that needed to be made. The Harrison pocket watch appeared on this list, marked with a notation indicating research complete and return planned for December 1985. The list contained 47 items total. Thomas had marked 18 as successfully researched and located. The hidden satchel contained only 5. That meant 13 pieces existed somewhere else, possibly already returned to families, or possibly still in Thomas's possession when he disappeared. Bank records corroborated the theory. Thomas's anonymous donations matched dates when certain families received unexpected monetary gifts accompanied by notes about inheritance discoveries. He had been making financial restitution when he couldn't return actual objects, attempting to balance historical wrongs committed by his ancestor. Detective Williams contacted several families who had received these mysterious donations. Most had assumed the money came from distant relatives or legal settlements. None had connected the gifts to the Bennett workshop or understood they represented compensation for items stolen decades earlier. The investigation expanded to examine whether anyone might have discovered what Thomas was doing and moved to stop him. Recovering and returning stolen property, even from a century ago, could damage reputations, disrupt current ownership claims, and expose families whose own ancestors had knowingly purchased questionable goods. In August, Jennifer discovered something else while organizing materials from the hidden room. Between the pages of Samuel's journals, she found photographs from the 1880s and 1890s showing the workshop's interior. The images revealed a young Samuel Bennett posing with various clients and colleagues. One photograph caught Jennifer's attention immediately. The image showed Samuel standing beside another man in the workshop, both smiling at the camera. The other man held a pocket watch, displaying it prominently. Jennifer recognized the timepiece as the Harrison watch, but the man holding it wasn't a Harrison ancestor. The handwritten caption on the photograph's back identified him as Jonathan Whitmore, dated 1886, 1 year before Samuel supposedly sold the watch to the Harrison family. This single photograph proved Thomas's research had been correct. Samuel Bennett hadn't purchased the watch through legitimate channels. He had obtained it directly from the Whitmore family during their financial collapse, then falsified its provenance to sell it at premium prices. The photograph raised an uncomfortable question. If Samuel had posed for pictures with items he was essentially stealing, how confident had he been that his actions would never be questioned? What level of social acceptance or willful ignorance had existed around such practices in 1880s Richmond? Detective Williams interviewed elderly members of ISA, prominent Richmond families, seeking oral histories about business practices in the late Victorian era. Several acknowledged that the economic chaos following the Civil War had created opportunities for sharp dealers to acquire valuable items from distressed families. The practice wasn't exactly legal, but it wasn't aggressively prosecuted either, particularly when buyers and sellers operated within the same social class. This context made Thomas's crusade to correct historical wrongs both noble and perhaps dangerous. He wasn't just returning stolen property. He was exposing a pattern of behavior that implicated multiple wealthy families across several states, families whose current descendants might not appreciate having their ancestors' questionable dealings brought to light. In September, the anonymous letters stopped arriving. Detective Williams had been working with postal inspectors to trace their origin, but before they could narrow down a location, the correspondence simply ceased. The final letter contained only one sentence, handwritten in neat script. Some doors should remain closed for everyone's protection. Jennifer refused to stop searching for her father. The discoveries in the hidden room convinced her that Thomas had been driven by conscience, not criminal intent. Whatever happened to him stemmed from his determination to right historical wrongs, even at personal cost. Then, in late September, a package arrived at the police station addressed to Detective Williams. Inside, he found a modern photograph showing a middle-aged man from behind, walking along a beach at sunset. The figure's posture and build matched Thomas Bennett's. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a date, January 1986, and a location, Outer Banks, North Carolina. Thomas Bennett had been alive at least 1 month after his disappearance. The question was whether he remained alive now, and if so, why he chose to stay hidden. The answer would emerge from an unexpected source, waiting in documents that Thomas himself had prepared, insurance against the possibility that his mission might cost him everything. The Horologist returns, October 2023. Nearly 4 decades after Thomas Bennett's midnight disappearance, the case existed only in archived files and in Jennifer Bennett's persistent memory. She had never stopped searching, though the trail had gone cold years ago. Now 68 years old, Jennifer maintained the workshop as a modest clock repair business, unable to let go of the space where her father had vanished. The reopening of the investigation came from an unexpected direction. Daniel Harrison, a 31-year-old horologist specializing in antique timepiece authentication, inherited his great-grandmother Elizabeth's estate that autumn. Among the family treasures, he found extensive documentation about a Victorian pocket watch that Elizabeth had cherished but never saw again after sending it for restoration in 1985. Daniel's professional curiosity was immediately engaged. A missing antique watch connected to an unsolved disappearance presented exactly the kind of historical mystery he loved investigating. His specialty involved using modern technology, database cross-referencing, and forensic examination to verify the provenance of antique timepieces. He began by researching Thomas Bennett's background, discovering the workshop still operated under Jennifer's management. The online horological community had kept the story alive as something of an urban legend, the craftsman who stopped all his clocks at midnight and walked away forever. Daniel contacted Jennifer through the workshop's website, introducing himself and explaining his connection to the case through the missing watch. Jennifer, initially skeptical of another person asking questions that had no answers, changed her mind when Daniel explained his technical capabilities and access to modern investigative tools unavailable in 1985. They met at the workshop in November 2023. Daniel brought sophisticated equipment, digital microscopes, spectral analysis tools, and access to international databases tracking stolen and recovered art and antiquities. Jennifer provided everything her father had left behind: journals, documents, the contents of the hidden room, and decades of unanswered questions. Daniel began by examining the timepieces from Samuel Bennett's secret collection. Using modern authentication techniques, he verified that many were indeed valuable antiques with documented histories. Several appeared in databases of items reported missing or stolen in the late 1800s, though the reports were so old that legal recovery was impossible. More significantly, Daniel discovered something Jennifer had missed. Several of the pieces contained tiny marks, almost microscopic engravings on interior components. These marks appeared to be identification codes, possibly added by Samuel Bennett to track items in his shadow inventory. Cross-referencing these codes with Samuel's cryptic notations revealed a system. Each code indicated the original owner's initials and the year of acquisition. Samuel had been meticulous about tracking his questionable dealings, perhaps realizing that future generations might need to understand and potentially rectify his actions. Daniel then turned his attention to materials Thomas had been researching before his disappearance. The documentation showed impressive detective work for someone without modern technology. Thomas had visited libraries, historical societies, and courthouses across multiple states, manually tracing ownership chains through handwritten records and newspaper archives. But Daniel could go further. He had access to digitized historical records, genealogical databases, and international auction house archives. Within weeks, he had verified and expanded upon Thomas's research, identifying not just the original owners, but their living descendants. The breakthrough came in December 2023, almost exactly 38 years after Thomas's disappearance. Daniel discovered an auction listing from 2019 for a collection of vintage watch repair tools and documents. The seller was listed as the estate of a deceased craftsman named Edward Mitchell, who had operated a small restoration business in a coastal town in North Carolina. Something about the listing caught Daniel's attention. One photograph showed a workbench with tools arranged in a distinctly methodical pattern. Daniel recognized the organizational system as identical to Thomas Bennett's method, documented in photographs from the 1980s. He traveled to the North Carolina town, a quiet community of fewer than 3,000 residents on the Outer Banks. The local funeral home connected him with the attorney who had handled Edward Mitchell's estate. The attorney confirmed that Mitchell had lived in the area since 1986, operating a modest restoration business until his death from heart failure in 2019. Daniel obtained permission to examine Mitchell's remaining personal effects still in storage. Among the materials, he found a collection of journals documenting clock repairs from 1986 through 2019. The handwriting in the earliest entries matched samples of Thomas Bennett's script that Jennifer had provided. The evidence became overwhelming when Daniel discovered personal photographs in Mitchell's belongings. Images from the 1990s and 2000s showed an older man with graying hair and weathered features, but facial recognition software confirmed a strong match with photographs of Thomas Bennett from 1985. Thomas Bennett and Edward Mitchell had been the same person. Daniel returned to Richmond with his findings, presenting Jennifer with proof that her father had lived at least until 2019, 34 years after his disappearance. The revelation brought both relief and renewed grief. Thomas had been alive all those years, working quietly under an assumed name, never returning home or contacting his daughter. But why? Jennifer needed to understand what had driven her father to such extreme measures. The attorney in North Carolina mentioned that Mitchell had left instructions for certain documents to be sealed until 2025, or earlier if someone came looking specifically for Thomas Bennett. Those conditions had now been met. The attorney provided Daniel with a locked metal box that Mitchell had deposited with his law firm in 1986. Inside, Jennifer and Daniel found extensive documentation, Thomas's confession of his plan, his reasons for disappearing, and the true story of what happened in December 1985. But they also found something more immediate and dangerous. The documents included photographs, modern ones from the 1980s, showing several prominent Richmond citizens meeting with Thomas Bennett in the weeks before his disappearance. The images captured heated conversations, exchanges of money, and what appeared to be threats. Thomas had documented his entire investigation into the historical thefts, including discoveries about which current families possessed items from Samuel Bennett's shadow collection. Several descendants had become aware of the questionable origins of their family heirlooms and had pressured Thomas to stay silent. The final item in the box was a letter addressed to Jennifer, written in Thomas's hand but dated January 2019, just months before his death. The letter began with an apology and a promise of explanation, but it also contained a warning. The truth about what happened in December 1985 implicated people whose families still wielded considerable influence in Richmond, people who had believed the secret died with Thomas's disappearance. By opening this box and pursuing the investigation, Jennifer and Daniel had potentially placed themselves in the same danger that had forced Thomas into hiding nearly 4 decades earlier. The question was no longer what happened to Thomas Bennett, but whether the forces that drove him away were still active, still protecting secrets they believed were safely buried in the past. Decoding the Past, January 2024. The letter from Thomas Bennett lay open on the workshop table, its pages yellowed, but the ink still clear. Jennifer read her father's words for the 3rd time, each reading revealing deeper layers of a carefully planned disappearance that had consumed nearly 4 decades of her life with unanswered questions. Daniel Harrison had spent the week since discovering the sealed box, analyzing every document Thomas had left behind. The materials painted a picture of a man caught between impossible choices, driven by conscience into a corner from which the only escape was erasing his own identity. Thomas's letter explained the events of December 1985 with meticulous detail. His research into Samuel Bennett's shadow collection had progressed further than Jennifer had realized. By November of that year, Thomas had identified not just the original owners of stolen timepieces, but also traced many items to their current locations in prominent households across Virginia. The Harrison pocket watch represented only one piece in a larger pattern. Thomas had documented 17 significant antique timepieces currently owned by respected families, all traceable back to questionable transactions involving Samuel Bennett between 1885 and 1900. The combined value exceeded $2 million, even by 1985 standards. Thomas had attempted to handle the situation discreetly. According to his letter, he had contacted several families privately, explaining his research and offering to facilitate quiet returns to legitimate heirs. Some families had been cooperative, hence the anonymous donations he had made to various descendants. Others had been less understanding. Daniel discovered evidence supporting Thomas's account. He located descendants of 3 families who confirmed receiving mysterious returned heirlooms in late 1985, accompanied by apologies for historical oversights. These families had assumed the returns came from distant relatives settling estate matters, never connecting them to the Bennett workshop. But Thomas's letter revealed a darker response from other families. 4 prominent Richmond households, all descended from Samuel Bennett's original clients, had reacted with hostility to Thomas's research. These families viewed the potential exposure as threatening not just valuable possessions, but their ancestors' reputations and their own social standing. The photographs from the sealed box documented meetings between Thomas and representatives of these families. Digital enhancement of the images, performed by Daniel using modern software, revealed recognizable faces. 2 were attorneys from established Richmond law firms. Another was a city council member from the 1980s. The 4th person's identity remained unclear, though facial recognition software suggested connections to a prominent banking family. Thomas's documentation indicated these individuals had offered him substantial payment to cease his research and destroy all evidence of Samuel Bennett's historical activities. When Thomas refused, citing moral obligations to the families whose heirlooms had been essentially stolen, the pressure intensified. The letter described threatening phone calls, warnings that pursuing his crusade would damage not just the families involved, but Thomas's own reputation and business. Someone had suggested that persistent investigation might reveal uncomfortable truths about Thomas himself, implying they possessed leverage to use against him. Most significantly, Thomas had received a direct threat on December 10, 1985. An unmarked envelope delivered to the workshop contained photographs of Jennifer, then 28 years old, going about her daily activities. No note accompanied the images, but the message was clear. Thomas's investigation endangered his daughter. This threat had forced Thomas's hand. He could not abandon his moral mission to correct historical wrongs, but he could not risk Jennifer's safety. The solution he devised was dramatic and permanent. He would disappear, allowing everyone to believe he had either fled in shame or met with an accident, while in reality establishing a new identity far from Richmond. The elaborate midnight departure had been carefully staged. Thomas had spent days preparing, purchasing train tickets he never intended to use, withdrawing cash in traceable ways to suggest flight, and arranging the workshop to appear abandoned mid-task. The stopped clocks at midnight were deliberate symbolism, marking the end of Thomas Bennett's existence and the beginning of Edward Mitchell's life. Daniel's investigation revealed how Thomas had accomplished the identity change. In 1985, such transformations were significantly easier than in the modern digital age. Thomas had obtained authentic documentation for Edward Mitchell, a real person who had died in infancy in 1947. Using this identity, he had relocated to North Carolina and built a modest life as a craftsman, maintaining his beloved trade while leaving behind everything else. The letter explained Thomas's decision to maintain complete silence with Jennifer. Any contact, no matter how careful, risked exposing his survival and potentially placing her in danger. He had watched from afar as she took over the workshop, proud of her resilience, but unable to ease her suffering without risking everything. Thomas's documentation included detailed evidence of the pressure campaign against him, recorded phone calls, saved threatening letters, and copies of materials he had sent to a trusted attorney in 1985 as insurance. The attorney had died in 2003, and these materials had apparently remained undiscovered until now. Daniel cross-referenced the names from Thomas's documents with current records. 2 of the individuals who had pressured Thomas in 1985 were deceased. The former city council member had died in 1998. One attorney had passed away in 2015, but the other attorney, now in his 80s, still practiced law in Richmond. The 4th person, whose identity Thomas had documented as Gregory Morrison, remained alive and active in local business circles. Jennifer faced a profound decision. She now possessed evidence that her father had been effectively driven into exile by threats from powerful families protecting their ancestors' reputations. The question was whether to pursue justice for wrongs committed nearly 40 years ago or honor her father's choice to let sleeping secrets remain buried. Daniel approached the situation from a different angle. As a professional horologist, he had ethical obligations to the broader community of collectors and historians. The documentation Thomas had compiled represented significant historical evidence about fraudulent provenance, claims that might still impact current ownership disputes. In February 2024, Daniel made a strategic decision. He contacted the American Horological Association, presenting them with redacted versions of Thomas's research that documented patterns of questionable authentication in late 19th century antique trading. The information was released academically, without naming specific families or connecting it directly to the Bennett case. The publication triggered immediate responses. Several families whose ancestors had purchased items from Samuel Bennett quietly contacted the association, seeking guidance on verification processes. Some chose to donate disputed pieces to museums with full disclosure of their uncertain provenance. Others simply removed items from public display, preferring to keep them as private family possessions without making ownership claims. But one response proved more aggressive. Gregory Morrison, now 83 years old, retained counsel and sent cease and desist letters to both the Horological Association and to Daniel personally. Morrison claimed defamation and threatened litigation if any materials specifically mentioned his family's collection. The legal threat confirmed what Thomas's documents had suggested. Someone still had powerful motivation to keep the full truth buried. Morrison's overreaction to an academic publication that hadn't named his family revealed exactly what Thomas's letter had warned about. Daniel and Jennifer now possessed complete documentation of what had happened in December 1985, why Thomas Bennett had disappeared, and who had driven him into hiding. The question was whether exposing the truth after nearly 4 decades would bring justice or simply create new dangers in a case where most of the original actors were dead and the crimes themselves had occurred over a century ago. The answer would come from an unexpected source. Thomas Bennett himself had prepared one final revelation, a testament recorded on videotape in 2018, intended to be released only after sufficient time had passed to protect everyone involved. That video, discovered in a safety deposit box Mitchell had maintained, was about to transform Jennifer's understanding of her father's choices and reveal that the story of the stolen timepieces was only part of a deeper, more complicated truth. The final adjustment, March 2024. The videotape arrived through Edward Mitchell's estate attorney, who had been instructed to release it 5 years after Mitchell's death, or immediately if Jennifer Bennett came forward seeking information. The tape had been recorded in 2018, just months before Thomas's death, using outdated technology that required Daniel to locate specialized equipment for playback. Jennifer watched her father for the first time in 39 years. Thomas, now appearing as the elderly Edward Mitchell, sat in a small room with weathered hands folded on a table. His face bore the lines of age and isolation, but his eyes maintained the intense focus she remembered from childhood. The recording ran for 47 minutes. Thomas spoke directly to the camera, addressing Jennifer by name and explaining decisions that had shaped both their lives. His voice carried regret, but also conviction that his choices, painful as they were, had been necessary. Thomas revealed that his research into Samuel Bennett's dealings had uncovered something beyond simple theft of antiques. Samuel had been part of an organized network of dealers who systematically targeted families in financial distress following the Civil War. The operation involved multiple auction houses, estate liquidators, and unscrupulous collectors who coordinated to acquire valuable items at fractions of their worth. This network had operated for decades, facilitated by the social chaos of Reconstruction and protected by the same class of wealthy individuals who benefited from the arrangements. Samuel Bennett had been a minor participant, but his meticulous records inadvertently documented the entire system. Thomas explained that when he began researching the Harrison watch, he uncovered evidence of this broader network. His findings threatened to expose not just his own family's history, but the questionable foundations of numerous prominent Southern families whose wealth had been built partially on exploiting others' economic desperation. The threats Thomas received in 1985 had come not just from individual families, but from a coordinated effort to suppress his research. The people who pressured him represented families whose ancestors had participated in the network Samuel documented. They viewed Thomas's investigation as threatening a carefully maintained historical narrative. Thomas's decision to disappear had been motivated by more than protecting Jennifer from direct threats. He realized that exposing the full truth would accomplish nothing positive. The crimes had occurred over a century ago. Most items had changed hands multiple times. Legal recovery was impossible, and the only result would be destroying reputations and reopening historical wounds. But Thomas could not simply ignore what he had learned. His solution was to make quiet restitution where possible while removing himself from the situation. The anonymous returns and donations he made in 1985 represented his attempt to balance moral obligations against practical reality. The video explained Thomas's life as Edward Mitchell. He had continued his craft, finding satisfaction in the work itself rather than the business aspects that had complicated his life in Richmond. He had watched Jennifer from afar, learning about her life through occasional discreet inquiries, proud of her resilience, but unable to ease her suffering without risking exposure. Most significantly, Thomas revealed that he had spent his years in North Carolina creating a comprehensive archive. Every piece of evidence he had gathered about Samuel's network, every document proving the systematic exploitation, every connection between past crimes and present families, had been carefully organized and preserved. This archive, Thomas explained, was not intended for public exposure, but as historical record. He had donated the materials under seal to the Virginia Historical Society with instructions that they remain closed until 2085, a full century after his disappearance. By then, everyone directly connected to the events would be deceased, and the information could serve historical understanding without causing personal harm. Thomas's final message to Jennifer combined apology and explanation. He acknowledged the pain his disappearance had caused, but maintained that no alternative existed that would have protected both her and the truth. He expressed pride in her stewardship of the workshop and hope that she might eventually understand his choices. The recording ended with Thomas performing one final gesture. He picked up a pocket watch from the table, the Harrison family timepiece that had started everything. He wound the mechanism carefully, set the time, and placed it in a wooden box. Thomas explained that this watch would be returned to the Harrison family after his death through his estate, with full documentation of its true provenance. Daniel Harrison had indeed received the watch through his great-grandmother's estate, though its origins had been unclear until now. The timepiece represented Thomas's commitment to making things right while minimizing harm, returning the stolen heirloom, but only after sufficient time had passed to prevent it from reopening old conflicts. Jennifer and Daniel faced the resolution of a mystery that had haunted Jennifer for nearly 4 decades. Thomas Bennett had not abandoned his principles or his family. He had made an impossible choice to protect both truth and people, sacrificing his own identity to serve competing moral obligations. The question remained what to do with this knowledge. Jennifer could expose everything, revealing the pressure campaign that drove her father into hiding and potentially pursuing justice against the surviving individuals involved. Or she could honor Thomas's decision that some truths serve better as sealed historical records than as weapons in present controversies. Daniel advocated for a middle path. The Horological Association agreed to establish the Thomas Bennett Memorial Archive, housing the technical aspects of his research without exposing the personal details. The archive would serve professional horologists seeking to verify antique provenance while respecting the privacy of families whose ancestors had been involved in questionable practices. Jennifer made the difficult decision to respect her father's choices. She would not pursue legal action against Gregory Morrison or others who had threatened Thomas in 1985. The crimes they had committed, intimidation and conspiracy to suppress evidence, were decades old and nearly impossible to prosecute. More importantly, Thomas himself had chosen to walk away rather than fight, a decision Jennifer finally understood and honored. The workshop underwent transformation. Jennifer established it as both a functioning business and a small museum dedicated to horological history. The space included exhibits about Samuel Bennett's career, though carefully framed to acknowledge historical context without glorifying questionable practices. Thomas's story was told through the lens of ethical evolution in the antiques trade. his moral struggle representative of broader questions about historical justice. Several families quietly approached Jennifer after learning the full story through discreet channels. Some offered belated apologies for their ancestors' actions. Others made anonymous donations to organizations supporting historical preservation and ethical collecting practices. These gestures, while not erasing the past, represented acknowledgement and attempts at contemporary amends. Gregory Morrison never publicly addressed the situation, though his family quietly donated their antique timepiece collection to a museum with provisions that all pieces be thoroughly researched and any questionable provenance be fully disclosed. The gesture suggested that even those who had once worked to suppress truth could eventually choose transparency. In June 2024, Jennifer held a private memorial service for Thomas Bennett, finally able to grieve properly with full knowledge of his fate. The service attracted horologists from across the country, many moved by the story of a craftsman who had sacrificed everything for principle. Daniel Harrison spoke about Thomas's technical skill and moral courage, framing his choices as emblematic of the difficult decisions facing anyone who discovers uncomfortable truths about the past. The case of Thomas Bennett's disappearance officially closed, resolved not through criminal prosecution, but through understanding. Thomas had walked away at midnight in December 1985, stopping his clocks to mark the end of one life and beginning of another. He had lived 34 years under an assumed name, maintaining his craft while protecting both truth and people from the consequences of full exposure. Jennifer inherited not just her father's workshop, but his ethical legacy. The business continued under the Bennett name, now representing not just technical excellence, but commitment to historical honesty and ethical practice. Every timepiece that passed through the workshop underwent thorough provenance research, ensuring that past patterns of exploitation were not perpetuated. The frozen clocks that had marked Thomas's disappearance were restored and mounted in the workshop museum, forever stopped at midnight. They served as reminder that some moments change everything, that principles sometimes require sacrifice, and that truth can be honored even when complete exposure would cause more harm than good. Thomas Bennett's story concluded not with answers to a simple mystery, but with understanding of complex moral choices. He had discovered uncomfortable truths about his family's history and faced impossible decisions about how to address them. His solution, disappearing into a new identity while quietly making restitution, represented one man's attempt to balance competing obligations to truth, justice, family, and mercy. The investigation that began with a missing craftsman ended with recognition that sometimes the most profound mysteries are not about what happened, but about why people make the choices they do when confronted with impossible situations. Thomas Bennett had made his choice at midnight in 1985, and nearly 4 decades later, that choice could finally be understood, if not entirely agreed with, as the decision of a good man facing circumstances with no perfect solutions. The workshop's clocks, all but those frozen at midnight, continued their precise marking of time, testament to the craft Thomas loved and the principles he maintained even at tremendous personal cost. Time, he had often said, was the one constant that demanded respect. He had given it that respect through his life's work, and ultimately, through the sacrifice of his own identity, to protect truths that time itself would eventually make safe to reveal.